Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to The History of Horror Cinema, a personal podcast journey through the good, bad, and ugly of the history of horror movies, based on my blog, The History of Horror Cinema. Oh, and please don't forget to hit subscribe. The Short Sharp Shocks of Laurel and Hardy. From 1927 through till 1935, the beloved movie-comedy duo of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy produced around 72 short films, from the silent era through sound, a run that for me represents most of their greatest work, other than the few later feature films such as Way Out West that weren't weakened by padding. Their slapstick and more subtle visual gags were perfect for the silent cinema, and they came equipped with amusing title dialogue cards whose humor translated seamlessly when turned into scripts for the talkies. Woven in amongst their output were a few much-loved shorts that contained some spooky frissons amid the laughs, and in a couple of cases could legitimately be called horror movies. But first, let's backtrack slightly to a little-known comedy horror gem that Stan Laurel did on his own, 2 years before meeting the partner who would help shoot them both to stardom. As an individual, Stan Laurel often played belligerent, highly physical characters, eager to spoil for a fight, quite a departure from the milder persona he would later contrast with the more overbearing Hardy. He'd been having combative relationships off-screen as well, going back and forth from working for Hal Roach to leaving him again temporarily for producer Joe Rock over a money dispute. And during a prolific burst of creativity churning out 24 shorts across 1924 to 1925, one of the 12 he made for Rock was another direct spoof of the various versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride is an exuberant and surprisingly funny two-reeler. Part of the fun is the wit of Tay Garnett's many title cards, undermining both the period and the characters from the novel with a modern subversiveness. Author Robert Louis Stevenson's meditation on the fear of evil overcoming good, echoed in the 1920 films In Each of Us, Two Natures Are at War, the Good and Evil, is here considered with such repercussions as even saxophone players would be tolerated. Dr. Stanislaus Pickle's high reputation precedes him, heaven knows why, the title card says. We then meet Laurel's Dr. Pickle pacing the floor of his laboratory while a quartet of learned colleagues hang on his pronouncements, apparently bored, awaiting his divine inspiration. His pince-nez glasses, slicked-back hair and dark lips contrast starkly with his blue eyes. Even more striking than his appearance is the rare chance to see Laurel taking a high-status role. He is a strutting peacock of Victorian intellectual pomposity, not the famously meek dimwit we love. The main pleasure of the film is actually watching Stan clearly enjoying himself in the dual title role, wherein he's equally funny as both halves, whereas Harold Lloyd, always a serious actor playing comedy, used a crack team of gag men and a sober, analytical mind to create the architecture of funny from the ground up. Laurel gives all the appearance of being allowed to just turn instinctively as the camera turns over. As with Jim Carrey, the joy is in his unfettered creativity in the moment. As Pickle, pre-Pride, he is firing on all cylinders in his facial expressions, dealing with his colleagues, and Julie Leonard as his assistant. The bonus for those who've seen the 1920 John Barrymore version is in the mischievous lampooning of this most respected film remake. In the main, the greatest Hamlet of his era was highly convincing as Hyde, and channeled his performance largely through an impressive lack of prosthetics, other than extended phalanges and a late-revealed pointy skull. Barrymore's wickedness, though, is matched by Laurel's in mocking the great profile's slightly overwrought metamorphosis into his alter ego. Instead of his predecessor's grasping of the throat and writhing, it is Pickle's legs that become supernaturally possessed after he downs what looks like a milkshake, labeled Pickle's 58th Variety, spoofing Heinz's 57 varieties. He wobbles spaghetti-legged, kicks and spins laughably before throwing himself out of the window to land in a match cut to a dummy that rivals Benny Hill for comedy obviousness. Surrounded by suitable period detail and costumes, from here Laurel hits the ground running, or rather squatting, in mimicry of Barrymore's bent-legged Hyde stride. To top off the imitation, he reproduces Barrymore's long dark wig and wide-eyed stare, but exaggerates his mouth into a permanently demented grin. Stan's comically evil Pride is rendered by a skilled transformative performance just as free of external makeup aids as his dramatic rival. Where the comparison ends is in the bad self's intention. Laurel spares us the slumming in dubious adult penny gaffes for this demon, rubbing shoulders and other body parts with the lower orders like previous iterations. Mr. Pride is the amusing, living embodiment of Pickles' childlike mischief, a lord of misrule more innocent than homicidal. Instead of the hideous trampling of the book's small child, we get the stealing of his ice cream cone. A woman is frightened by Pride bursting a paper bag behind her back. More cheeky spoofings of the 1920 version abound. Whereas Hyde attempts to ingratiate himself with a flower delivered to a young woman at her door, Pride embarrasses her by converting it into a party streamer blown in her face. The groundbreaking dissolve shots of Barrymore's metamorphosis are comically copied. Whereas Jekyll's smooth hand is shown in close-up, gradually becoming that of the gnarled Hyde, Pickles hilariously morphs into low-budget pen daubings over his knuckles and veins. Laurel's team also add their own ideas, extending Pickles' repeated accident-prone spilling of acid to the consequences if his dog was to eat food dripped upon by it. The result is the perfectly deadpan reappearance of the pooch in his own fright wig, forcing Pickle to try to conceal him against his colleagues suspecting his connection to the bestial murderer. The ending varies slightly according to different surviving prints. There is a 19.5-minute version attributed to director Percy Pembroke, or Joe Rock and Scott Pembroke according to some sources, which ends with Stan's advance on Leonard being met with a vase cracked over his head. Also, there exists a 2-minute longer version, approved by a display card of the old British Board of Film Censors, directed by Harry Sweet, whereby, after her rebuttal, Mr. Pride loops himself intimately under Leonard's necklace, while his learned colleagues clamour outside for him, which then cuts inconclusively to an end piano credit. Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride was the only comedy horror send-up that Stan Laurel experimented with alone. The theme of split personality extremes would, however, be mined repeatedly in his future partnership with Hardy. For example, his concussion-inspired transformation into posh Lord Paddington in A Chump at Oxford, his sudden bass and then female crooning of the Trail of the Lonesome Pine in Way Out West, after Ollie coshes him with a mallet, and the unsettlingly funny playing of each other's wives in Twice 2. What may also have inspired Stan during Dr. Pickle was the two conflicting faces of the public and private he had to wear during its making, owing to debilitating domestic battles fought with his own common-law wife May Dahlberg. Simon Luvish's invaluable biography, Stan and Ollie, The Roots of Comedy, documents how Stan was forced after their vaudeville act ended to include May in his films despite her limitations of talent and looks compared to the belles of the day like Mabel Normand. He strained relations with his bosses by having her co-star status written into his contracts. But, behind the scenes, this clash of wills and May's delusions of stardom ate away at the foundations of the non-marriage, the gentlemanly deal between May and Stan. Soon, with the dissolving of Stan's ties to May, his happiest of collaborations was to come. In early 1925, Oliver Hardy came to work for the Hal Roach studio. Now, Laurel and Hardy's paths would properly narrow to a comic collision of history-making movies together that would be their real lasting legacy, eclipsing all their individual work. Habeas Corpus, 1928. Laurel and Hardy's wonderful short subject plots could be based around any single idea, no matter how outlandish. From the sophisticated body swap of playing each other's wives in Twice 2 and devilish baby versions of themselves in Bratz, to a simple premise like leaving home in time for a wedding, or just leaving home, period, in Perfect Day. Along the way, they cleverly gave the laughs an extra frisson by battling such darker forces as vengeful villain Walter Long and scorned harpy Mae Bush. The first Laurel and Hardy short to inspire ghoulish guffaws was Habeas Corpus in 1928, which has the unique distinction of two Oscar-winning directors behind it, as well as Leo McCarey, who insisted he mostly wrote for them, and here is credited as supervising director. James Parrott went on to helm many of their classics like The Music Box in 1932, and also their next horror comedy after this, The Laurel and Hardy Murder Case. Strictly speaking, Habeas Corpus is a silent film, but for fans accustomed to their later ones, it feels very much like a sound film with the soundtrack removed and replaced with an orchestra, plus added whistles, woodblocks, and other effects. The inciting protagonist is the balding, mad scientist Professor Padilla, Richard Carle, who follows in a long line of horror movie medical wackos with his experiment to prove that the human brain has a level surface, in some cases practically flat. The irreverent H.M. Walker is the wit behind the titles, though such is the strength of the sight gags to come that he's barely needed. The professor needs the help of enterprising idiots who can provide him with a body from a little nocturnal grave robbing. As if by tragic, without seeing them, we get a lovely visual clue as to who the prospective Burke and Hare will be. A close-up of a prissy hand dismissing that of another person to take over knocking on the door. It is Stan and Ollie, ever ready to bypass common sense in favor of ready money. In this case, $500 for the job. Little do they know, even less than usual, that the butler is an undercover policeman by the name of Ledoux. Very likely an in-joke reference to Inspector Ledoux in Lon Chaney's The Phantom of the Opera. Charlie Rogers in the role would work with Laurel and Hardy many more times over the years. The police seize the nutty professor while the boys head to work. Along the way, Stan shows rare powers of perception in suggesting their employer might be a trifle cuckoo, emphasized by a cuckoo effects cue. Ollie reminds us that the pair's partnership extends to sharing the one brain by assuring him, "He is as sound mentally as you or I." The boys head for the graveyard, where, as usual, even getting into the graveyard isn't simple for those simple in mind. After wet paint shenanigans, they spend over 3 minutes in increasingly haphazard and funny bids just to get Stan hoisted over the wall by Ollie. Once in, though, it may not be gruesome for the twosome, yet their night shift becomes hair-raising courtesy of a seemingly ghostly wandering lamp, placed on a nearby tortoise by Stan. A rubber bat that may be related to the unconvincing flapper seen in Bela Lugosi's 1931 Dracula, and the close surveillance by Ledoux that turns him into a running, smoky spectre to terrorize our heroes. The pace is excellent, and the high gag rate sustains throughout. Look out for Ollie's demonstration of how to properly use your friend to scale a wall, or in his case, utterly demolish it. One of their sublime moments of destruction that always deserves a rewind. There's even a nice possible nod to Buster Keaton in the way that Ledoux, bagged by mistake, pokes his leg through Stan's hefted sack and walks behind him in perfect sync. Habeas Corpus is a great example of a comedy team adding a touch of spookiness to a short, exploiting a single idea, playing on its main character's relationship, and sustaining the chaos to the end. From here, audiences would now be able to hear their mirthful exchanges as well as see them.